Case 1. Ned Christie. In 1887, in the wooded hills outside Tahlequah in the Cherokee Nation, a well-respected Cherokee leader named Ned Christie went from the most trusted man in his community to the most wanted man in the territory almost overnight. A U.S. Marshal named Dan Maples had been shot dead nearby, and because the dead man worked for the federal government, the case was pulled away from the Cherokee courts and handed to a judge over in Fort Smith, Arkansas named Isaac Parker, whose nickname, the Hanging Judge, was not exactly meant as a compliment. Christie swore up and down that he had never touched Maples, and knowing full well what was waiting for him in that courtroom, he refused to travel there and hand himself over, so the government simply branded him a runaway and came out to take him by force. What they did not count on was how long one determined man could make them work for it. For 5 straight years, Christie held them off from a log cabin he had turned into a fortress, sitting up on a hill the locals started calling Ned's Fort Mountain. Its walls built double thick and stuffed with sand so that bullets sank in and simply stopped. Some of the most famous lawmen in the whole country took their turn against him, including the legendary Bass Reeves, and one raid in early 1892 went so badly that the marshals mostly managed to shoot 3 of their own men by mistake. Then, on the 3rd of November 1892, a group of somewhere between 16 and 22 men rolled up with rifles, dynamite, and an actual Army cannon they had borrowed from a fort up in Kansas. The cannonballs bounced off those sand-packed walls like pebbles, and when the frustrated crew stuffed in extra gunpowder to give it more punch, the cannon blew itself apart instead of the cabin. In the end, they pushed a wagon forward as a rolling shield, packed dynamite against the wall, and blew a hole clean through it, setting the whole place on fire. Christie came charging out of the flames, bandaged and half-blinded, firing both pistols until they finally brought him down. They hauled his body back to Fort Smith, propped it upright with a rifle placed in his lifeless hands, and sold the photograph as a postcard. And years later, sworn statements would turn up naming another man entirely as the one who really killed Dan Maples. Case 2. Elfego Baca. In late 1884, in the dusty little town of Frisco, New Mexico, a 19-year-old named Elfego Baca pinned on a lawman's badge that nobody had really given him and decided he was the sheriff whether people liked it or not. A drunk Texas cowboy named Charlie McCarty had been firing his pistol off inside a saloon just for fun, so Baca walked in and arrested him on the spot. The problem was that McCarty rode for one of the roughest cattle ranches in the whole region, and when word got back to his friends, roughly 80 armed cowboys came thundering into town demanding that Baca hand their men over or pay for it. Baca did not hand him over. Instead, he ducked into a tiny mud hut belonging to a local man named Geronimo Armijo, and that turned out to be the smartest move of his life because the floor inside had been dug down below ground level, which meant any bullet punching through the flimsy wall sailed harmlessly over his head while he stayed crouched down low. For somewhere between 33 and 36 hours without stopping, that mob fired an almost unbelievable number of bullets into the little building. Most accounts say around 4,000 shots, and at one point, just to show them he wasn't scared, Baca calmly lit a fire and cooked himself breakfast right in the middle of it. By the time it was finally over, he had killed 4 of the cowboys and wounded 8 more, and he did not have a single scratch on him. The shooting only stopped when the mob started running low on bullets and help arrived to calm everything down. Even then, Baca refused to just walk out and get grabbed. He only agreed to give himself up once a lawman he actually trusted promised to keep him safe and carry him off to a proper court instead of a rope. So they took him to court for murder, and they did it twice. What saved him was simple. Someone brought in the wooden door from that little hut and stood it up in front of the jury, and it had more than 400 bullet holes shot straight through it. Nobody could look at that door and believe one man had been given anything close to a fair fight. Baca walked free, went on to become a lawyer, a mayor, and finally, a real sheriff, and he died in 1945 as one of the most loved heroes New Mexico ever had. Case 3. Geronimo. Back in May of 1885, out in the rugged country where Arizona meets Mexico, an Apache leader named Geronimo slipped away from the reservation where the government had penned up his people and set the whole Southwest on fire. He took only a small group with him, just a few dozen men, women, and children, but that tiny band moved like ghosts, hitting ranches and settlements on both sides of the border, stealing horses, burning homes, and leaving dozens of dead settlers and soldiers behind them as they ran. That was the part that terrified everyone, because this was not an army doing all this damage. It was barely more than one big family, and they were running circles around the entire region. The first general sent after him, George Crook, actually came close to talking him into giving up. But the deal fell apart at the last minute when a shady trader sold the band a load of whiskey and the whole thing dissolved into confusion. So the government swapped Crook out for a tougher general named Nelson Miles, who threw everything he had at those few dozen people. He put pieces of 4 different cavalry units on Geronimo's trail, hired Apache scouts who knew the land, and teamed up with around 200 Mexican soldiers on the far side of the border. He even built a chain of signal stations on the mountaintops that bounced coated flashes of sunlight off mirrors from one peak to the next, so the second anyone spotted the band, the warning could race across the desert faster than any horse. And after all of that, thousands of soldiers, mirrors on the mountains, 2 whole governments hunting one family, what finally brought Geronimo in was not a bullet or a trap. It was heartbreak. Word reached him that his people's families were being loaded onto trains and shipped all the way to Florida no matter what he did. So on the 4th of September 1886, he handed his rifle to General Miles and stopped running. He had spent nearly 20 years staying a step ahead of the most powerful army around, and almost no one ever made them look so helpless. Case 4, Cochise. In February of 1861 in the mountains of southern Arizona, a young Army officer named George Bascom made one of the dumbest mistakes in the history of the West. A local boy had been stolen by Apaches, and Bascom, with no real proof, decided the man to blame was a Chiricahua Apache chief named Cochise. He invited Cochise into his tent for what was supposed to be a peaceful talk, with everyone relaxed, and then suddenly announced that the chief was under arrest until the boy was returned. Cochise reacted before anyone was ready, slashing a hole through the back wall of the tent and bursting out at a dead run. And though the soldiers opened fire and a bullet grazed him, he was simply too fast to stop. He made it into the hills, but several of his relatives who had come to the talk with him were grabbed and held behind. That may have blown over, but then Bascom made it far worse. To get even, the army hanged those relatives, his brother and 2 nephews, men who had come in peace. After that, there was nothing left to talk about. Cochise joined his father-in-law, an older and equally feared chief named Mangus Coloradus, and the 2 of them went to war for 25 years. They knew every canyon and hidden waterhole out there, so they could sweep down on a ranch, a mining camp, or a wagon train, kill the men, take the horses, and vanish into the rocks before help could arrive. Bodies piled up across Arizona. Whole towns were abandoned, and for more than 10 years, not one soldier the government sent could catch him. The war did not end with a big battle. In the fall of 1872, a general named Oliver Howard tried the one thing nobody else had: riding out alone to meet Cochise with no soldiers and no guns. And that show of trust finally reached him. Cochise did not really surrender. He made a deal, winning his people a piece of their own land and reportedly saying the white man and the Apache should drink the same water, eat the same bread, and be at peace. That peace lasted about 2 years until Cochise died in 1874, and almost the second he was gone, the government tore up its promises. Case 5, the Dalton Gang. On the morning of October 5, 1892, 5 outlaws rode into the little town of Coffeyville, Kansas to pull off something no gang had ever tried before. They were the Dalton Gang, 3 brothers named Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton, riding with 2 partners named Dick Broadwell and Bill Powers. And they had already built a fearsome name for themselves, robbing trains all across the territory. But robbing one bank was no longer enough for them. They were going to hit 2 banks at the very same time in broad daylight, and to make it even wilder, they chose their own hometown to do it, a place where half the people on the street knew their faces. Almost nothing went the way they planned. They rode in wearing fake mustaches, but the town had recently torn out the hitching rail where they meant to leave their horses, so they were forced to tie the animals in a cramped side alley instead. As they crossed the square, people began recognizing them anyway, and word raced through town that the Daltons were robbing the banks. Inside one of them, a sharp teller looked Grat Dalton dead in the eye and calmly lied, telling him the safe was on a timer that could not be opened for another 10 minutes. Grat believed him and waited, and those were the most expensive 10 minutes of his life, because outside, the townspeople were busy grabbing rifles and shotguns off the shelves of the hardware stores. When the gang finally stepped back out into the street with the money, the whole town was waiting for them. What followed was a furious 12-minute gun battle right there in the open square, with ordinary shopkeepers and farmers trading fire with some of the most wanted men in the country. By the time the smoke cleared, 4 of the 5 outlaws were dead, including Bob and Grat Dalton, and 4 brave townsmen had been killed defending the place they lived. Only young Emmett Dalton crawled away alive, carrying 23 separate gunshot wounds in his body. He spent 14 years in prison, then did the most surprising thing of all. He moved to California and became a Hollywood screenwriter, selling the story of the day his own town shot his gang to pieces. Case 6. The Battle of Ingalls. On September 1, 1893, 13 or 14 U.S. deputy marshals quietly rode into the tiny settlement of Ingalls, Oklahoma Territory, thinking they were about to pull off an easy arrest. Hiding out in a saloon in that town was the Doolin-Dalton Gang, a band of outlaws led by a robber named Bill Doolin and by Bill Dalton, a brother of that same Dalton family from Coffeyville who had been smart enough to sit the last disaster out. The lawmen had the gang outnumbered and surrounded, and on paper this should have been the day the law finally won. It did not turn out that way. What the marshals did not know was that the gang had a deadly sharpshooter named Arkansas Tom Jones, and he was not down in the saloon with the others. He was up in the attic of the town hotel, perched at a high window with a clear view of the whole street below. The moment the shooting started, Jones began picking men off from above like it was target practice, and within just minutes, he had shot 3 deputy marshals dead before most of them even figured out where the bullets were coming from. From that one high window, he had turned the entire town into a killing field. The fight spilled out into the streets and turned into total chaos, with gunfire coming from every direction and the lawmen unable to knock Jones out of his perch. In desperation, they finally resorted to throwing dynamite at the hotel just to blast him loose. But while everyone was busy dealing with the man in the attic, most of the gang, including both Doolin and Dalton, simply jumped on their horses and galloped straight out of town through the crossfire. When it was all over, 3 deputy marshals lay dead, 2 innocent townspeople had been killed in the shooting, and the only outlaw the law managed to capture was Arkansas Tom Jones. The rest had gotten clean away. The beating was so bad that 3 of the most famous lawmen in the West spent years afterward, hunting the escaped gang members down one at a time. A rare day in the Old West when it was the posse, not the outlaws, that got shot to pieces. Case 7. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. By 1908, 2 of the most famous outlaws America ever produced were on the run so far from home that they thought no one would ever find them. Robert Leroy Parker, better known as Butch Cassidy, and his partner Harry Longabaugh, the man everyone called the Sundance Kid, had spent a whole decade robbing banks and trains across the American West with their gang, the Wild Bunch. When the country got too hot for them, they did something almost no outlaw thought to do. They sailed all the way to South America and started a new life in the mountains of Bolivia, figuring the law back home would simply lose their trail. For a while, it worked, but old habits die hard. On November 4, 1908, the 2 men held up a payroll delivery belonging to a Bolivian mining company, stealing the wages meant for a whole crew of workers. The problem was that they also made off with the company's mules, and those animals carried a very recognizable brand, so it did not take long for people to spot them and start asking questions. The trail led the authorities to a small boarding house in a tiny village called San Vicente, where the 2 outlaws had stopped for the night. That evening, a couple of soldiers and a local policeman came to the house to check on the strangers, and Cassidy reportedly opened fire the moment one of them stepped into the courtyard, shooting a soldier in the neck. A gun battle erupted in the dark and rattled on for about 20 minutes before the whole place went silent. When the villagers crept in the next morning, they found both men dead inside, and the wounds told a grim story. It looked less like the soldiers had killed them, more like the 2 friends, cornered and out of options, had chosen to end it themselves rather than be taken alive. And here's where it gets strange, because no one at the time ever truly proved those bodies belonged to Butch and Sundance. For decades afterward, people back home swore they had received letters from Cassidy long after he was supposedly dead. And to this very day, nobody can say for certain how the story of the 2 most legendary outlaws in the West actually ended.